At the start of the movie, we see our main character, Nancy. She's a young woman who has just found out she's pregnant. Right now, she's with her best friend Tabitha and nervously shares that she tested positive. When asked who the father is, Nancy pauses, then admits she doesn't know. She's been involved with more than one man recently, making it impossible to say for sure. Since Nancy works at a restaurant during the day, she quickly heads to work. She's driving, lost in music, when suddenly her car breaks down. Stuck on the side of the road, she has no choice but to walk. On her way, she runs into Bobby, her co-worker who always rides his bicycle to work. To avoid being late, she hops onto Bobby's bike and they speed toward the restaurant. When they arrive, Nancy heads straight to the restaurant owner's office. But here's the twist. He's not just the owner, he's her father. Nancy has just been promoted to restaurant manager, and her father wastes no time reminding her what that means. She needs to be more disciplined and responsible because her co-workers now look up to her. On top of that, her father has a date later that evening. Nancy's mother passed away years ago, and after so long, he feels it's time to find companionship again. Since he'll be out, he asks Nancy to stay late and handle the closing shift. Later that night, as she's cleaning up, Nancy spots leftover food on a customer's plate. Suddenly, she feels sick. She rushes to the back and throws up. Jake, the restaurant chef and her father's most trusted employee, happens to be nearby. He watches Nancy carefully, his suspicion growing. Could she be pregnant? But when her father arrives and sees her vomiting, Jake quickly covers for her, blaming it on bad meat. Her father doesn't suspect a thing. With her father gone for the night, Nancy continues working. Not long after, Peter, a kind but mentally disabled employee, accidentally spills water on the floor. Nancy understands and doesn't get mad. But then things take a turn. A group of teenagers, known troublemakers in the area, ride up on their bikes. They don't come to eat. They come to cause chaos. Not wanting any trouble, Nancy immediately steps outside to send them away. However, her pregnancy is making her more irritable and her patience is wearing thin. She snaps at her employees, scolding Peter for not cleaning up fast enough. But things only get worse. The teenagers return, this time wearing masks. They pretend to order food, but their real plan is to push Nancy's buttons. Frustrated, she loses her cool and yells at them to get out. The kids just laugh. When Nancy threatens to call the police, one of them smirks and says they'll be back in 10 minutes. Furious and feeling unsupported, Nancy lashes out. Not just at the troublemakers, but at her own staff. She scolds everyone. Bobby, Peter, and even Jake for standing by and doing nothing. Jake, the restaurant's most experienced employee, tries to calm her down, saying the kids were just joking around and that she overreacted. But Nancy isn't in the mood to listen. Without thinking, she fires Jake on the spot. Everyone freezes, even Jake is shocked. Despite being her father's most trusted employee and the restaurant's main chef, he's just been let go. Jake quickly apologizes, explaining that he really needs this job. He has bills, insurance, and medication to pay for. But Nancy doesn't back down. She stands by her decision and orders him to leave. After firing Jake, she washes her face, trying to pull herself together. Bobby, meaning well, checks on her. But she snaps at him too, telling him not to act like he cares now. She's left alone for the night shift. She calls her father to tell him about firing Jake, and he's shocked. He scolds her for making such a rushed decision. Yes, the menu isn't too complicated. Yes, she could handle cooking herself. But replacing Jake won't be easy, and with the restaurant already struggling financially, they can't afford mistakes like this. Nancy could have closed up early, but with overdue bills piling up, she has no choice but to stay open until morning. Alone in the empty restaurant, she tries to shake off the stress. She plays music, cleans up, and even dances around, turning on the disco lights for fun. But then something catches her eye. Across the street, parked under the dim streetlights, are the teenagers' bicycles. They're back. Nancy grabs the loudspeaker and warns them that she's calling the police. But instead of backing off, the masked teens laugh, then bang! They start slamming their fists against the restaurant windows. Louder, harder. Nancy panics and actually calls the police this time. But the response isn't what she hoped for. All units are busy with a murder case elsewhere. It may take some time and only one officer will be sent. One officer? That's it. With no other choice, Nancy has to hold on by herself. She watches as the masked teenagers circle the restaurant like wolves. Then they begin their attack. While hiding in the kitchen and searching for her phone, Nancy suddenly hears a police siren. Relief washes over her. Help has finally arrived. A police officer steps out of the car and begins checking the area. He notices an open water tap, as if someone had just used it. He reports back to headquarters, assuring them that everything seems under control. Nancy rushes out and describes the masked teenagers on mopeds. But the moment she does, the officer's face changes. Those kids, he's seen them before. They were just involved in a brutal murder case he came from. That realization sends chills down Nancy's spine. The officer, trying not to alarm her, admits he had just left the crime scene. The same masked figures terrorizing her now were responsible for something far worse. Before he can say more, bang! A masked teenager rushes in and brutally kills the officer. Nancy barely has time to react. She runs to the storage room and hides, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. That's when Bobby appears. Without thinking, she grabs him and pulls him into the kitchen, both of them trying to stay out of sight, but it's too late. The teenagers find them. Nancy and Bobby are tied up, forced to sit facing each other. The attackers toy with them, making them kiss for their sick entertainment. Nancy struggles, refusing to give in. Furious, the masked figures drag her to the back of the restaurant. But she's not giving up that easily. In a desperate move, she breaks free, grabs a knife, and cuts one of the attackers. Clutching the blade, she runs out of the restaurant. One of the teenagers chases after her on a moped. Nancy, moving backward, grips the knife tightly. But in the chaos, she accidentally stabs Peter. Shock freezes her. What did she just do? Before she can process it, the horrifying truth is revealed. Jake, Bobby, and Bobby's brother Jackson were behind it all. To understand how things spiraled into this nightmare, we need to go back to the afternoon when Nancy fired Jake. But before we continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Now let's go back. Jake was a drug addict. He didn't need his job to pay bills or survive. He needed it to fund his habit. Peter, his younger brother, was always forced to do whatever Jake said. That afternoon, they had gone to buy drugs from a dealer. Jake, out of money, begged for credit, showing a gun he kept in his car's glove box. On their way back, high and unstable, Jake spotted a group of masked teenagers having a bonfire by the roadside. He pulled over, but he wasn't there to hang out. He was there to blame someone. In his clouded mind, he believed that if the teenagers hadn't come to the restaurant, Nancy wouldn't have gotten angry, and he wouldn't have lost his job. And that's when his rage took over. Without hesitation, he stabbed one of the teenagers, then opened fire, killing the rest in a violent rage. The most tragic part? Peter, who knew nothing, who wanted no part in this, was forced to go along with it. And now the real nightmare is just beginning. After killing the teenagers, Jake and Peter loaded the mopeds and masks into their car. Jake then told Peter to go to the restaurant while he headed to Bobby and Jackson's house. When Jake arrived, still fuming, he complained about Nancy's behavior earlier that day. Fueled by anger, he came up with a plan to prank Nancy by disguising themselves with the masks and mopeds. Bobby and Jackson, always up for some chaos, immediately agreed. Bobby briefly asked where the masks and mopeds had come from. Jake, hiding the truth, casually said he had borrowed them from some teenagers hanging around nearby. Nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, Peter had already reached the restaurant, but as he stepped inside, he noticed his hands still covered in blood from the earlier events. Panicked, he rushed to the back and scrubbed them clean at the water tap, the same tap the police officer would later notice. Soon after, Jake, Bobby, and Jackson arrived at the restaurant and began their reign of terror, banging on the windows, lurking in the shadows, doing everything they could to scare Nancy. As we saw earlier, their plan worked, but then the police officer showed up. The group scattered and hid while Nancy and the officer talked about the murder case. Jake, afraid of being caught, crept up from behind and struck the officer down. That was the moment Nancy hid in the storage room, terrified. Bobby, watching everything unfold, began to feel guilty. Unlike the others, he hadn't expected things to go this far. Making a quick decision, he took off his mask and pretended he had just arrived to help Nancy. But by then, everything was already out of control. Then came the tragic moment. Nancy, in the heat of fear and panic, accidentally stabbed Peter. Poor Peter. He was never meant to be part of this. He was dragged into the nightmare simply because of his selfish brother Jake. But Nancy wasn't completely without blame either. If she had handled things differently, if she hadn't fired Jake in such a reckless show of authority, maybe none of this would have happened. As Peter bled, Jake told Jackson to watch over Nancy, while he and Bobby carried Peter inside to treat his wounds. But the moment Jackson let his guard down, Nancy saw her chance. She bolted toward the back of the restaurant, tripping over a bag of rotten meat, and that's when an idea struck her. Meanwhile, inside, Jake desperately tried to stop Peter's bleeding. Bobby, now fully realizing how out of control things had become, quietly grabbed the police officer's car keys. He needed a way out. At that same moment, Nancy's father, still on his date, kept calling Jake about the firing. Despite Nancy's emotional decision, her father never actually planned to let Jake go. He wanted to talk things over, maybe even ask Jake to stay. But it was already too late. Jake had gone too far. And besides, his phone was still sitting in his car, unanswered. Nancy found herself in a tense chase with Jackson, barely avoiding his attacks. In a desperate move, she threw hot oil at him, forcing him back and before ultimately having to take his life to survive. Breathing heavily, she hid under a table, her eyes scanning the blood-soaked floor. That's when she saw Bobby lying motionless, covered in blood. He had fought Jake, but clearly lost. At that moment, Tabitha arrived, responding to Nancy's earlier call. But as soon as she saw the scene inside the restaurant, she panicked and ran away, leaving Nancy to face it alone. Ignoring Tabitha's escape, Jake focused on Nancy, who had bolted toward the storage room. The sun was beginning to rise as Nancy made a desperate break for freedom, but Jake was faster. He caught up to her, stabbing her from behind before dragging her back into the restaurant. He had no idea she was pregnant. Without hesitation, he plunged the knife into her stomach and left her there, assuming she was dead. But he was wrong. Nancy slowly opened her eyes, still alive. The rotten meat she had wrapped around her stomach earlier had absorbed most of the impact, preventing a deadly wound. Jake had been tricked. Struggling to her feet, she glanced at Bobby, barely clinging to life. And that's when she finally told the truth. The baby she was carrying was his, the result of a drunken night at a party. With no time to lose, Nancy grabbed the police car keys and made her way to Jake's house. She had to end this. Without much effort, she caught Jake off guard, attacked him from behind, and put an end to his terror once and for all. Weak from blood loss, she stumbled back to the restaurant. Moments later, her father arrived. Taking in the horrifying scene before him, his voice trembled as he asked what had happened. This movie leaves us with a clear message. Decisions made in anger often lead to disaster. A true leader must stay calm, never acting on impulse just to prove a point. Never make decisions when you're angry, and never make promises when you're overly happy. Patience and wisdom are the key to avoiding catastrophe. And that's the wild story of Last Straw. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments.